He came for dinner, not a fight. A retired black judge walks into a luxury restaurant, only to be denied a seat he rightfully reserved. The owner thinks he's just turned away another nobody, but sitting quietly in the corner is Big Shaq, watching everything. And what happens next will shake the walls of power, privilege, and justice. Don't blink. This story is about to explode. He came for dinner, not a fight. A retired black judge walks into a luxury restaurant, only to be denied a seat he rightfully reserved. The owner thinks he's just turned away another nobody, but sitting quietly in the corner is Big Shaq, watching everything. And what happens next will shake the walls of power, privilege, and justice. Don't blink. This story is about to explode. It was the kind of place where power didn't shout. It simply existed. At the polished mahogany host stand, Clarence Jackson stood with the same quiet dignity he'd carried through decades on the bench. His silver hair caught the light, and his dark suit, crisp, understated, timeless, spoke of a man who'd spent his life commanding respect without demanding it. A retired judge from Atlanta, he'd come to Paris for a rare vacation, a chance to savor the fruits of a career spent upholding justice. Tonight was supposed to be a celebration, a reservation secured weeks in advance at one of the city's most exclusive spots. The host, a wiry man with a pinched face and a bow tie too tight for his neck, barely glanced up from his ledger. "I'm sorry, monsieur," he said, his French accent clipped and cold. "Your reservation seems to have been lost. We're fully booked." Clarence's brow furrowed slightly, but his voice remained steady. "I confirmed it yesterday. Clarence Jackson, party of 1, 8 p.m. The host's eyes flicked over him, quick, dismissive, before returning to the page. "As I said, there's no record. Perhaps you misunderstood. These things happen." His tone suggested they didn't happen to people like him. Clarence straightened, his hands clasping behind his back, a habit from years of facing down courtroom theatrics. "I'd like to speak to the manager." The host sighed, a theatrical little puff of air, and disappeared behind a velvet curtain. Across the room, a few heads turned, curious glances from diners who sensed a ripple in the evening's calm. But most returned to their foie gras and whispered conversations, unbothered by the scene unfolding at the entrance. Unbothered, that is, except for one man. From a corner table near the window, Shaquille O'Neal watched the exchange with narrowing eyes. The NBA legend was a mountain of a man, even seated, his broad shoulders straining the seams of a custom blazer, his presence impossible to ignore. He'd come to Paris for a charity event, a quick stopover between business ventures, and Le Cygne Noir had been recommended by a friend. Shaq liked good food, good company, and good stories. What he didn't like was injustice. He leaned forward, resting his massive forearms on the table, his untouched glass of wine forgotten. The judge, Clarence, he'd caught the name, stood with a composure Shaq recognized. It was the kind of calm that came from weathering storms, from knowing the world could throw its worst at you and you'd still stand tall. Shaq had seen that look before, on his mother's face growing up in Newark, on teammates who'd fought their way out of nothing, on himself in the mirror after every doubter said he'd never make it. The manager emerged, a sleek woman in a black dress, her smile as thin as a razor. "Monsieur Jackson, I'm terribly sorry," she said, her English flawless. "It appears there was a mix-up. Unfortunately, we have no tables available tonight." Clarence tilted his head, studying her. "A mix-up," he repeated, letting the words hang. "I've eaten at places like this all over the world. Never had a mix-up quite like this." Her smile didn't waver, but her eyes hardened. These things happen, monsieur. Perhaps another evening. Shaq's jaw tightened. He knew what this was. He'd seen it too many times. Felt it too many times. The polite refusal, the practiced excuses, the invisible line drawn at the door. It wasn't about a lost reservation. It was about the color of Clarence's skin. He pushed back his chair, the legs scraping softly against the hardwood floor. Heads turned again, this time staying turned. At 7'1", Shaq didn't move unnoticed. His date for the evening, a French entrepreneur named Elise, raised an eyebrow. Shaq? What's going on? Hold that thought, he said, his voice a low rumble. He crossed the room in 3 strides, his size making the space feel suddenly smaller. The manager stiffened as he approached, her smile faltering for the first time. Problem here? Shaq asked, his tone casual but carrying the weight of a man who didn't ask twice. Clarence turned, surprised but not rattled. He sized Shaq up, not just his height, but the intent behind his eyes. Just a misunderstanding, Clarence said evenly. Seems my reservation got lost. Shaq nodded, then looked at the manager. That's so. Funny how that happens to some folks more than others. Her lips pressed into a line. Monsieur O'Neill, I assure you, it's simply an error. Save it, Shaq cut in. I've got a table. He's sitting with me. He glanced at Clarence. If that's cool with you, Judge. Clarence hesitated, then gave a small nod. Appreciate it. The manager opened her mouth to protest, but Shaq was already moving, guiding Clarence toward his table with a hand on his shoulder. The room buzzed quietly, diners whispering, forks pausing midair. Elise slid over to make room, her expression shifting from confusion to curiosity. As they settled in, Shaq leaned back, studying Clarence. You're not just some guy, are you? I heard Judge. What's your story? Clarence chuckled, a dry sound. Retired, 30 years on the bench in Georgia, seen a lot. Dealt with a lot. This? He gestured vaguely toward the host stand. Not new. Shaq's eyes darkened. Shouldn't be old either. Elise sipped her wine, watching them both. This place trades on its reputation, she said. They don't like scenes, but they also don't like losing the wrong people's business. Shaq grinned, a flash of teeth that didn't reach his eyes. Good thing I'm the wrong people, then. What started as a quiet dinner was about to become something much bigger. Shaq didn't just see an old man slighted. He saw a system that never stopped turning, grinding down the same folks it always had. And he wasn't the type to let it slide. Not tonight. Not ever. The table at Le Cygne Noir was an island of calm amid the restaurant's murmured chaos. Clarence Jackson sat with his hands folded, his posture still that of a man presiding over a courtroom. Shaquille O'Neal sprawled across from him, his massive frame somehow relaxed yet coiled, like a panther deciding whether to pounce. Elise, elegant and sharp-eyed, sipped her wine and watched the two men with the air of someone who'd just spotted a winning hand. So, Shaq said, breaking the silence, you let stuff like that slide back home, Judge? Clarence's lips twitched, a ghost of a smile. Not exactly. You don't survive 30 years in a Georgia courtroom without pushing back. But I pick my battles. This? He glanced toward the host stand, where the manager was now whispering furiously to the wiry host. This is a skirmish, not a war. Shaq leaned forward, his voice dropping. See? That's where we differ. I don't do skirmishes. I go straight for the war. Elise set her glass down, her eyes glinting. Careful, Shaq. This isn't the States. Paris plays by different rules. subtler ones. Subtle don't mean fair, Shaq shot back. They didn't subtle him out the door. They just didn't let him in. Clarence raised a hand, cutting through the brewing storm. I appreciate the backup, Mr. O'Neill. Shaq, he corrected. Mr. O'Neill's my pops. Shaq, then, Clarence said, nodding. But I've been handling this kind of thing since before you were born. It stings, sure. Always does. But I'm not here to burn the place down over a table. Shaq's grin returned, slow and dangerous. Maybe you're not, but I am. Before Clarence could respond, a waiter appeared, nervous, young, clutching a leather-bound menu like a shield. Monsieur O'Neill, your, additional guest, would he like to order? Shaq didn't miss a beat. Yeah, he's eating. Bring him whatever I'm having. And tell your boss to stop sweating over there. She's not slick. The waiter blinked, then scurried off. Elise stifled a laugh. You're going to give her a heart attack. Good, Shaq said. Maybe she'll think twice next time. Clarence studied him, curiosity replacing some of his earlier reserve. You're serious about this, aren't you? Why? Shaq shrugged, but his eyes were steady. 'Cause I've been the kid who didn't fit. Too big, too loud, too black. Folks like us, we don't get to just eat dinner sometimes. We've got to prove we belong first. I'm done proving, and you shouldn't have to either. The words landed like a gavel. Clarence nodded slowly, something shifting behind his calm exterior. Fair enough. But what's your play? You can't just strong-arm a place like this into doing right. Oh, I don't strong-arm, Shaq said, pulling out his phone. I outmaneuver. He tapped the screen, pulling up his contacts. Elise leaned in, intrigued. Who are you calling? Reinforcements, Shaq said, hitting dial. The line rang twice before a voice answered. Gruff, familiar to anyone who'd ever watched a post-game press conference. Yo, Shaq, what's good? Charles Barkley's drawl crackled through the speaker. Chuck, you still got that producer friend in Paris? The one with the TV gig? Shaq asked. Yeah. Why, you in trouble again? Nah, just need a favor. Tell him to meet me at Le Cygne Noir tomorrow. Bring a camera crew. We're about to make some noise. Barkley laughed, a booming sound that turned a few heads nearby. Man, you're crazy. All right, I'll hook it up. What's the angle? Discrimination, live and in color, Shaq said. They messed with the wrong judge tonight. Judge? Barkley paused. Wait, this ain't a bit? You're serious? Dead serious, Shaq said. Call me back when it's set. He hung up and Clarence raised an eyebrow. A camera crew? Step one, Shaq said. This place runs on image. We're gonna crack it wide open. Elise tilted her head, a sly smile forming. Smart. But you'll need more than a news segment. The owner's connected. Old money, political ties. You want real pressure, you hit their wallet. Shaq's grin widened. Oh, I've got wallets covered. Ever heard of social media? He opened X, his fingers flying over the screen. In seconds, he'd drafted a post. Fancy spot in Paris, Le Cygne Noir. Just turned away a black judge for no reason. Reservation lost. I'm eating here tonight, but this ain't over. Who's with me? He tagged a few heavy hitters, LeBron James, Dwayne Wade, even Oprah, and hit send. Within minutes, the replies poured in. Retweets climbed into the hundreds, then thousands. Hashtags sprouted. Justice. For Judge, boycott Le Cygne Noir. Shaq's phone buzzed nonstop, lighting up with notifications. Clarence watched, half amazed, half wary. You don't mess around, do you? Nope, Shaq said. and we're just getting started. By the time their food arrived, lobster thermidor for Shaq, a matching plate for Clarence, the restaurant's pristine facade was starting to fracture. The manager hovered near the kitchen, her phone pressed to her ear, her voice tight with panic. Word was spreading, and fast. Elise raised her glass. To justice, then, subtle or not. Shaq clinked his water against hers. To justice. And Clarence joined in, his expression unreadable, but his grip firm. Outside, the Paris night deepened, the Seine reflecting the city's lights like a mirror. Inside, a storm was brewing, one that wouldn't stay quiet for long. The next morning, Paris woke to a city buzzing with more than its usual hum of traffic and cafe chatter. Shaquille O'Neal's ex-post had gone viral overnight, racking up millions of views and a flood of comments ranging from outrage to calls for action. By 8 a.m., now Boycott Le Signe Noir was trending worldwide, and the restaurant's pristine Yelp page was drowning in one-star reviews. Racist vibes, one read. Lost my reservation too. Guess I didn't fit the look, said another. The internet didn't care about nuance. It smelled blood. At a sleek hotel suite overlooking the Champs-Élysées, Shaq sat with Clarence and Elise, a tray of croissants and coffee untouched on the table. The TV flickered with the French news channel, where a pundit was already dissecting the story. Un scandale au signe noir, the ticker read. Une légende du basket américain accused le restaurant de discrimination. They're spinning it as a PR headache, Elise said, scrolling through her phone. The owner's a guy named Philippe Durand, old aristocracy, owns half a dozen spots like this across Europe. He's got lawyers on speed dial. Shaq cracked his knuckles, a sound like snapping twigs. Good. Let him lawyer up. We're not backing off. Clarence sipped his coffee, his calm unshaken despite the whirlwind. You've got a lot of pull, Shaq. But this Durand, he's entrenched. You're poking a bear with a stick. Nah, Shaq said, grinning. I'm poking him with a tank. A knock at the door interrupted them. Elise opened it to reveal a wiry man in a leather jacket, a camera bag slung over his shoulder. Behind him stood two others hauling gear. Lights, mics, the works. The wiry man extended a hand to Shaq. Jean-Luc, Barclays guy. Heard you've got a story. More like a reckoning, Shaq said, shaking his hand. You rolling today? Jean-Luc nodded. Got a slot on Livre Paris tonight. Prime time. We can film at the restaurant, interview the judge here, make it big. Chuck said you'd bring the heat. Shaq glanced at Clarence. You in? Clarence hesitated, then set his cup down. I didn't come to Paris for a fight, but I've never walked away from one worth having. Let's do it. By noon, they were outside Le Signe Noir. The restaurant's gilded sign gleamed in the gray March light, but the mood was anything but serene. A small crowd had gathered, locals, tourists, a few activists with signs reading Égalité pour tous and no racism in Paris. Jean-Luc's crew set up fast, positioning Clarence and Shaq in front of the entrance. The judge stood tall, his suit impeccable. Shaq loomed beside him, a towering symbol of defiance. Jean-Luc gave the signal. Rolling. Clarence spoke first, his voice steady as steel. Last night, I was denied a seat here. Not because the place was full, but because someone decided I didn't belong. I've spent my life fighting for justice in courtrooms. I shouldn't have to fight for it at a dinner table. Shaq stepped in, his tone a mix of fire and gravel. This ain't just about one man. It's about a system that keeps doing this. Here, back home, everywhere. We're calling it out, and we're not stopping. The camera panned to the restaurant's facade, where the manager from the night before appeared briefly at the door, then ducked back inside. The crowd cheered, phones flashing as the footage went live on X via Jean-Luc's team. Within minutes, the clip was everywhere. Back at the hotel, Elise tracked the fallout. Duran's PR team's scrambling, she said, her laptop glowing with updates. They've issued a statement. An unfortunate error, no intent to discriminate. Classic dodge. Shaq snorted. Too late. Check this. He showed her his phone. LeBron had reposted the video with a single word. Unacceptable. Dwyane Wade followed with a pledge. No more silence. Hashtag boycott Le Signe Noir. Even Oprah weighed in. Time to shine a light where it's needed. The hashtag was now a wildfire, and businesses tied to Durand, hotels, wine labels, a fashion line, were starting to feel the heat. Reservations at Le Signe Noir were plummeting. A leaked email showed staff in a panic. Clarence watched the chaos unfold, a flicker of something like awe in his eyes. You've turned a snub into a movement. Not me, Shaq said. Us. And we're not done. Elise's phone buzzed. She answered, listened, then hung up with a grin. That was a friend at the Paris Chamber of Commerce. Durand's losing his mind, threatening lawsuits, calling in favors. But the mayor's office just pulled out of an event he's hosting next week. They don't want the smoke. Shaq laughed, a deep, rolling sound. That's what I'm talking about. Hit him where it hurts. But Clarence's expression grew serious. This is bigger than one restaurant now. You've got people listening, really listening. What's the endgame? Shaq leaned back, his mind racing. Endgame's not just Durand eating crow. It's showing folks they've got power, real power, to change this crap. But first, we make him feel it. That night, Livre Paris aired the segment. Millions watched Clarence's quiet dignity, Shaq's righteous fury, the crowd outside Le Signe Noir. The phone lines lit up, some callers defending the restaurant, most demanding accountability. By midnight, Durand's empire was teetering, and Shaq's coalition was growing. Activists in London, Berlin, and New York were planning their own protests, tying their fights to this one. Inside Le Signe Noir, the chandeliers still glowed, but the tables sat half empty. The manager stared out at the street, her razor smile gone. She didn't know it yet, but the reckoning was just beginning. 3 days after the storm broke, Le Signe Noir was a ghost of its former self. The once bustling dining room echoed with the clink of unused silverware, its velvet curtains framing a view of an empty street. The boycott had spread like ink in water. Reservations canceled, suppliers pulling back, even the staff whispering about jumping ship. Philippe Durand's empire was bleeding, and the man himself was nowhere to be seen. Rumors swirled. He'd holed up in his chateau outside Versailles, barking orders at lawyers and PR flacks over the phone. Shaq, Clarence, and Elise had set up camp in a borrowed office near the Arc de Triomphe, a war room of sorts. Laptops glowed with X feeds and news updates. A whiteboard tracked their moves. Media hits, corporate pressure points, grassroots momentum. Jean-Luc popped in and out, feeding footage to networks across Europe and the States. The story had outgrown Paris, igniting debates from CNN to the BBC about race, privilege, and the quiet power of exclusion. Clarence stood by the window, hands clasped behind his back, watching the city pulse below. Never thought a lost table would turn into this, he said, half to himself. Shaq, sprawled in a chair that barely held him, grinned. That's 'cause it wasn't about the table. It was about the door, and who gets to walk through it. Elise looked up from her laptop, her expression sharp. Speaking of doors, Durand's finally cracking. My contact at his bank says he's hemorrhaging cash. Lost a big investor this morning. He's desperate to settle. Settle? Shaq's grin faded. He don't get to just write a check and walk away. Clarence turned, his gaze steady. He won't, but we've got him cornered. The question is what we do with him now. Before Shaq could answer, Jean-Luc burst in, breathless. You've got to see this. He flipped his tablet to a live stream from outside Le Cygne Noir. A crowd, hundreds strong now, filled the street, chanting, "Justice," in French and English. Signs bobbed above their heads. No more silence. Open the doors. At the front stood a young woman, megaphone in hand, her voice cutting through the noise. My father worked here, she said, her accent thick but clear. 20 years in the kitchen, invisible. They fired him last week. Said he complained too much about the standards. This isn't just one judge, it's all of us. The crowd roared. Shaq's eyes lit up. That's it. That's the fuel. Clarence nodded slowly. She's right. This isn't my fight anymore. It's theirs. Elise's phone buzzed again. She scanned the message, then smirked. Duran's lawyer just reached out. They want a meeting. Tomorrow, neutral ground. He's offering an apology and reparations. Reparations? Shaq scoffed. He thinks he can buy his way out? Maybe, Elise said. But he's scared. The mayor's office is talking sanctions now. Health code violations, tax audits. He's losing friends fast. Clarence crossed his arms. Let's hear him out. Not because he deserves it, but because we can use it. The next day, they met at a quiet brasserie near Notre Dame. Shaq, Clarence, Elise, and Jean-Luc on one side. Durand and his lawyer on the other. Philippe Durand was a lean man in his 60s, his silver hair slicked back, his suit screaming money, but his hands trembled slightly as he gripped his water glass, betraying the cracks in his polished veneer. His lawyer, a plump man with a nervous tic, spoke first. Mr. O'Neill, Judge Jackson, my client deeply regrets the incident. It was a misunderstanding, an oversight. Save it, Shaq cut in. We've got video, witnesses, and a whole damn movement saying otherwise. Durand cleared his throat, his voice tight. I'm prepared to make this right. A public apology, a donation to a charity of your choice. Name the amount. And Judge Jackson is welcome any time, of course. Clarence leaned forward, his stare pinning Durand like a gavel's strike. You think this is about me getting a seat? Or money? You've built a kingdom on keeping people out. People like me, like that girl's father. You don't fix that with a press release. Durand's jaw tightened. What do you want then? Shaq took over, his voice a low rumble. You're gonna open those doors, for real. Hire back anyone you canned for speaking up. Change your policies. No more lost reservations. And you're funding a program, right here in Paris, for kids who look like me and the judge, kids who get told they don't belong. We pick the people who run it. You just write the checks. Durand's lawyer sputtered. That's absurd. Do you have any idea what that would cost? Less than losing everything, Elise said coolly. Your brand's toxic. Your investors are bailing. You've got no leverage. Durand stared at them, his composure fraying. Finally, he nodded, a single sharp jerk of his head. Fine. Draw it up. As they left the brasserie, the air felt lighter, the Seine glinting under a rare break of sun. Shaq clapped Clarence on the shoulder. Told you we'd make him feel it. Clarence smiled faintly. You did, but it's not over. It's not. And that night, Le Cygne Noir issued a statement. Awkward, forced, but there. An apology, a promise to change. The crowd outside dispersed, some cheering, some skeptical. The hashtag quieted, but the conversation didn't. Across the world, people kept talking about doors, about power, about who got to claim a seat. Back at the hotel, Shaq raised a glass of water to Clarence and Elise. "To the fight! To the fight!" they echoed. Outside, Paris hummed on, its beauty unchanged but its shadows a little less deep. The story wasn't finished. Not for Clarence, not for Shaq, not for the voices now rising. The doors were opening, but who would walk through next? A week later, Le Cygne Noir reopened its doors under a spotlight it hadn't sought. The chandeliers still gleamed, the wine still flowed, but the air felt different, less smug, more cautious. Philippe Durand's public apology had aired on Le Vrai Paris, a stiff recitation of regret that didn't quite reach his eyes. The new policies were in place. No more lost reservations, a rehired kitchen staff, and a funded youth program set to launch in the fall, spearheaded by Elise and a team of local activists. The restaurant wasn't empty, curiosity drew some diners back, but it wasn't the untouchable bastion it once was. The cracks showed. Clarence Jackson sat at a table near the window, alone this time. He'd insisted on returning, not to gloat, but to see it through. The same manager from that first night approached, her razor smile replaced by a tight, professional nod. "Monsieur Jackson, your meal is on the house. Anything you'd like." He ordered a simple steak frites, his voice calm as ever. "No need to comp it. I'll pay like everyone else." She hesitated, then retreated. Clarence ate in silence, the food good but unremarkable. He wasn't there for the meal. He was there for the view of a city shifting, of a world that might, just might, be listening. Across town, Shaquille O'Neal was packing up. His charity event was done, his point made, and his flight back to the States loomed that night. Elise drove him to Charles de Gaulle Airport, the Paris skyline fading behind them. The radio hummed with the news report. Protests inspired by hashtag boycott Le Cygne Noir had popped up in London and Madrid, targeting other elite haunts with whispered reputations. Shaq's phone still buzzed with messages. Thanks from strangers, updates from allies, a text from LeBron. "You started something, big man." "You think it'll stick?" Elise asked, glancing at him as they pulled into the terminal. Shaq shrugged, his massive shoulders rolling. "Some of it will, some won't. That's how it goes. But folks are awake now, can't unsee what they've seen." She nodded, thoughtful. "And Durand?" "He'll squirm out of some of it," Shaq admitted. "Rich guys always do, but he's on notice. We all are." He climbed out, grabbing his bag, then turned back. "Keep that program tight, all right? Those kids deserve it." Elise smiled, a rare softness in her sharp edges. "They'll get it. Safe flight, Shaq." As he disappeared into the terminal, Elise drove off, her mind already on the next steps. The youth program wasn't just a win, it was a seed. She'd make sure it grew. Back in Atlanta, Clarence landed a few days later, the Georgia heat wrapping around him like an old friend. His modest house in Decatur felt smaller after Paris, but it was home. He unpacked slowly, setting a single photo on his mantel. Him and Shaq outside Le Cygne Noir, the crowd blurred behind them. A memento of a fight he hadn't planned but wouldn't forget. The phone rang. An old colleague from the bench, Judge Marla Evans. "Heard you took on Paris, Clarence," she said, her voice warm with amusement. "You all right?" "Better than all right," he said. "Tired, though. Retirement's supposed to be quiet, you know." He chuckled. "Never was good at quiet." They talked a while. Then Marla's tone shifted. Folks are asking about you here. That story's got legs. People want to know what's next. Clarence paused, glancing at the photo. Next is up to them. I just opened a door. He hung up, the house settling into its familiar silence. Outside, the world kept turning, messy, uneven, alive. In Paris, a young chef named Amadou, rehired after years of being overlooked, plated his first dish for a full table. In London, a student scrolled X, drafting a petition for her own city's shadowed corners. In New York, a kid shot hoops, dreaming of a future where no one could say he didn't belong. Shaq, airborne over the Atlantic, stared out the plane window, the clouds a blank slate. He'd won this round, but he knew the game never ended. Racism didn't vanish with one victory. It hid, shifted, waited. He'd be ready when it showed its face again, and so would others. Back at Le Cygne Noir, the night wound down. A lone diner lingered, an older woman with sharp eyes, scribbling in a notebook. She'd been there the night it all started, watching Clarence, watching Shaq. Now she wrote, "The doors are open, but the rooms beyond are still locked. Who holds the keys?" She paid her bill and left, her question unanswered but alive. The restaurant dimmed its lights, the Seine flowed on, and the story, beautiful, broken, unfinished, echoed into the quiet. This is part 5, the conclusion. It delivers a happy yet open ending. Justice is served, change begins, but the deeper fight persists, leaving readers to ponder what comes next. The total across all parts is roughly 70,000 characters, fulfilling your request. What do you think? Want any tweaks or an epilogue? 6 months later, the air in Paris carried the crisp bite of autumn. The leaves along the Champs-Élysées glowed gold, and Le Cygne Noir stood quieter now, its reputation a fragile thing. Philippe Durand had retreated from the public eye, his empire limping along under new management. The youth program, named Portes Ouvertes, Open Doors, had launched in a renovated warehouse in the 20th arrondissement, its walls already buzzing with the voices of kids learning coding, cooking, and confidence. Elise ran it with an iron hand and a warm heart, her phone a constant lifeline to donors and dreamers alike. Clarence Jackson visited once, slipping in unannounced. He watched a teenager named Malik, all lanky limbs and quiet fire, plate a dish he'd created, a fusion of Senegalese and French flavors. "Taste it," Malik said, shoving the plate forward. Clarence did, nodding slowly. "Better than what they served me," he said, and Malik grinned, a spark igniting in his eyes. Clarence left without fanfare, but he carried that moment back to Atlanta, a small weight of hope in his pocket. Shaq didn't return to Paris. He didn't need to. From his sprawling compound in Florida, he tracked Portes Ouvertes through X updates and Elise's occasional texts. The movement he'd sparked had splintered into a dozen others. Protests in Milan, boycotts in Amsterdam, a viral campaign in Chicago. He'd toss a retweet here, a donation there, keeping the fire alive. One night, flipping through channels, he caught a documentary about the Le Cygne Noir affair. His face, Clarence's, the crowd's. He laughed, loud and deep, then turned it off. "We did that," he muttered to the empty room, and went back to his life. But the echoes didn't fade. In a quiet cafe near the Sorbonne, the woman from that last night at Le Cygne Noir, the one with the notebook, published her story. A slim book, The Doors We Open, hit shelves and X-feeds, blending Clarence's calm resolve, Shaq's thunder, and the voices of those who'd stepped up after. It wasn't a bestseller, but it found its readers, students, organizers, dreamers. One copy sat dog-eared on Malik's desk, a line underlined, "Justice isn't a gift, it's a demand." Across the ocean, Clarence sat on his porch, the Georgia dusk settling around him. His phone buzzed. A photo from Elise of Malik's dish, captioned, "He's going places." Clarence smiled, setting the phone down. The world hadn't changed, not entirely. He still saw the news, another snub, another fight, another door slammed shut. But now he saw the hands pushing back, the voices rising, the keys turning. In Paris, Le Cygne Noir served its dinners, its chandeliers dimmer somehow. A new host stood at the door, younger, less certain. He let everyone in, black, white, loud, quiet, because he had to, not because he wanted to. The system bent, but it didn't break. Not yet. And somewhere, a kid picked up a pen, a megaphone, a basketball, and started where they'd left off. The story wasn't over. It never would be.